you know, on Hemp Hill, there was a Texas Steel Company.
Yes.
And in Spanish, you know, a founder is fundición. And so a lot of the neighborhood worked there. And so they called the neighborhood La Fundición.
Okay.
And so they were celebrating their 100th anniversary, and they asked me to do a presentation. So I went to some of the older people and got a little information. And then I put in my family's information.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to start from the top. Could you please state your full name and your occupation?
Hortencia Laguna, and I'm a retired school nurse.
And where did your family live before coming to the U.S.? Where they were from the U.S.? What part of the U.S.?
No, my family was from Mexico. My mother came from Cerritos, San Luis Potosí. She was born in a little village close to Cerritos, but she was raised in Cerritos. My daddy was from Pánuco, Veracruz.
And when did they come to the U.S.?
I've always thought it was kind of in 1914, but my brother said no. I think it was a little after that. They crossed the border around between 1910 and 1914 during the Revolution.
Okay. So they were fleeing the Revolution.
The Revolution and a better life. My mother was an orphan, and my aunt was going to come to the States with her daughter, so mother tagged along because she didn't have anybody up there anyway.
And did both of your parents come directly to Fort Worth?
Yeah.
Okay. And you were born here in Fort Worth?
Yes.
Okay. What neighborhood did you grow up in?
La Fundición.
And in what part of Fort Worth?
South Side.
And did you grow up in any other neighborhoods here? Okay. And what schools did you attend?
I went to Katy Lake. That was a little two-room school in the neighborhood. It was across the street from the church. And they had built that to keep the Mexicanos from coming across Hemp Hill to South Fort Worth Elementary. So I started, and this was a couple of blocks from my house, I started school there, first, second, and third. That was in that two-room building. And then I went to South Fort Worth, which is Wilson Elementary now. In the fourth grade, I went there.
And then did you keep going on?
Yeah, I went to Rosemont Middle School, and I walked there. We had to walk. There was
How far was that?
At least a mile.
Oh, wow. And what high school did you attend?
Pascal. I graduated from Pascal and then got married, had 5 kids. After I had 5 kids, and the last one was in kindergarten, I told my husband I wanted to go. TCJC was just going to open, and I wanted to go. And he said, "What for? You've got 5 kids. Don't you have enough to do at home?" And we didn't fight because he had the last word, but I cried. And finally he said, "Well, go on. You're going to do what you want anyway." He let me go. And you wouldn't believe the story behind that. You know, my husband had a trim shop. He had a car upholstery shop. And my oldest son, Frankie, was just a young teenager, barely in his teens, and he was kind of working on weekends. And my husband would pay him. And my son would come home and say, "Here, Mom, this part is for you." He'd give me $5 of his money. And he didn't earn much more than that. And I said, "No, Frankie, it's your money." He said, "Mom, I want you to have it." So I took it, put it aside. I thought, next time he needs something, I'll take from that money. Because I wasn't working. I was at home. And so when my husband said, you know, that go on and do what you want to. Okay, so I went. I took the money my son had given me, and I registered at TCJC, just part-time, because I still had that kindergarten I had to come pick up. And that's how I started. And then, you know, next semester, when she was full-time, I went full-time. So, and then I graduated from the junior college, and I got a job at Peter Smith. My husband said, I knew it. I knew you were going to want to work. Why not? So I got a job at Peter Smith, and later he was very, very supportive. He saw that I was serious, and he backed me up in anything I wanted to do. I went to Mexico with a medical team because one year they were going to go to Pánuco, and I thought, that's where my dad's from. My dad would be, he had just passed away, and I thought he would be so proud if I went to his hometown as a nurse, which, you know, nobody in my family had graduated from college. So I went to, my husband said, yeah, go ahead. You've got a good cause. And so I went to Pánuco. And then after that, I went with Dr. Gracia and the medical team for about 7 years. I went as a nurse. I volunteered 1 week of my work, my vacation. I would volunteer in Mexico with a medical team.
So you just had to get your husband used to.
Yeah, and you know what? At one time later, he became a diabetic, and his insurance Prudential dropped him. And I picked him up on my insurance. And then he said, you know, you made a good decision when you decided to go. He was happy. And from then on, he backed me up. Anything that I wanted to do, he was very supportive, very, very supportive.
And
that may be my brother.
okay. Can you tell me what churches you attended?
Let me turn that thing off because that's my daughter. Barbara, I'll talk to you later, okay? I'm in the middle of an interview. Bye.
What video, you can always cut things off, but what churches did you attend when you were?
Okay. When I was growing up in La Fundición, in the hood, we had a little church. It was called Santa Ana. Later, it became Immaculate Heart of Mary. But that's where I went. That's where I did my first communion.
And then now?
Okay. Then at that time, I don't know if you remember, the church, the Catholic Church said, you go to the church in the area that you belong to. That's what you're going to do. So when I moved from I got married, we lived in El Barrio for a while. And then we moved across Hemp Hill. We went to St. Andrews, because that's where we belong. When we moved up to Wedgwood, then I went to St. Bartholomew. That's where I'm going. At one time, the priest told me, or he asked me, we were at a Jamaica at Immaculate Heart, but I was going to church over here. And he said, Hortencia, can you teach a class for me? And I said, sure. You know, when you're in a school nurse, like I was, and a teacher comes to you and says, can you teach a class for me? Oh, sure. They may want you to teach toothbrush, you know, dental hygiene or whatever, one class, and that's it. And I thought that's what he was talking about. He said, Hortencia, can you teach a class? Sure, I can. And then the secretary called me and said, I'm so glad you're going to be teaching confirmation for us. What? I thought it was one time. No, that's for the whole season. So I did. So then I might as well join that class, because I felt I could be of some service over there, more than I was at St. Bart's, which is a much larger church. But here a few years back, 2 or 3 years ago, my daughter Becky had joined with me. She didn't want me to go by myself, but then my other daughter, Barbara, was still going to St. Bart's, and she said, I sure wish y'all would come back. I feel so alone. So I quit, because I wasn't teaching anymore at Immaculate Heart. I quit I told them I was going to leave. I'm going to go back to my family. And so I'm at Immaculate Heart. I'm at St. Bartholomew.
Okay. And What were your parents' names? And you already said where they were from, but can you tell me their occupations?
Fernando Pacheco, my dad, he worked at anything that he could. He didn't have much of an education. Mother didn't either. I remember at one time, way back in the Depression, I may have been in 1939, something like that. He would deliver circulars. Him and my brothers, I remember them coming in from the weather, and it was sleeting. It was so cold out there, but they had been delivering circulars. They were paid 75 cents a day, and he did that. He picked cotton, whatever. When my brother went to the service, well, all my brothers went to the service. I had 8 brothers, and they went in the Army or Air Force or whatever. One of them didn't come back. Blas was killed by the Japanese. He was in Bougainville, in the island of Bougainville, and he didn't come back. He had been working at the steel mill, so my daddy went and asked him, can I take his place? So of course they let my dad take, so he had a permanent job at the steel mill, and he stayed there until he retired. There at the last, they had him just tending to the garden, you know, around the front offices.
And your mom was a stay-at-home mom?
For a long time she was, but then during the war she went to work at the TP, La Casa Redonda, the roundhouse. I don't know what she did, but she never had worn pants in her life, and when she was short and chunky, and when she started working, she was wearing pants. My brothers would tease her so much.
What was her name? I'm not
Demetria Garcia Pacheco. And I have her history too.
Great. And can you tell me about a little bit of your family history? And can we start off with you listing the names of your brothers? And you had 8 brothers, correct? Did you have any sisters?
3. 2 sisters and myself. There were 3 of us.
List all the siblings from oldest to youngest, say their name and where they are now?
You know, that's one of the questions, that if they send a social worker out to your house to see how well you are, and they asked my brother, can you name your kids? He said 11 of them. He named part of them, and she took that to court because he couldn't remember all of them. But my oldest brother was Raymond, Blas, Adam, Amelia, Francis, Joe, Roy, Isaac, Bencha, D'Alvin, and Dicky.
And for the most part, did they stay in Fort Worth, or did they leave to other cities?
They all stayed in Fort Worth except D'Alvin. When he was in the service, he came out. His wife wanted to go to California, and they went to California. And he stayed there about 30 years, but then about 15 years ago, he wanted to come back home and be with the family. He had divorced his wife, and so he moved back to Fort Worth.
Okay. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your family history?
My family history, or can I tell you about the history? What I've wanted to share with you is the history of the La Fundición, the neighborhood.
You can share anything you want with us. And I'm not sure where you can capture if you have images very well, but...
What I have is a printed copy. I have my brother, when my brother was killed in the service. You want to see if you are interested in it?
No, and we have a librarian who can copy all this down to keep. But if you want to say anything about the history you recorded about La Fundación, which you grew up in the area, so you can say anything.
I can give you a copy of this also.
That would be great.
Because I went back, okay, let me tell you, when my daddy said he was coming to the United States, during the time of the Revolution, he said you didn't have to have a passport. You put 3 cents down and they would tell you go on. 3 cents is all it took to cross the border. And so that's the time that he came. Later, they wanted him to have a passport. He didn't have a passport, but he got one. And he said, my son gave his life for this country. I think you owe me a little bit. So he got a passport, and he was able to go back and visit his, he had one sister left. All the family had died. But, okay, I went back and talked to some of the people older than me. I found a lady that was in her 90s, but her mind was so clear. Her name was Albertina Diaz Vargas. And she told me how La Fundición, the steel mill, they wanted workers, and the Mexicanos were real good workers, so they built, across the tracks, they built 10 shotgun houses. You know what those are?
Straight hallway.
Yeah. Okay, they built 10 of them. And she had the names of all those families. And anyway, she gave me a lot of information. Butch Vasquez also told me about even working at Eagle Mountain Lake when they were building Eagle Mountain Lake. That hadn't been around forever. He remembered that. And I have the names of all those families from way, way back there. And I think you had Rita Rodriguez. I had the groceries and the grocery stores we had in the barrio were Don Meregildo, Don Prisciliano, who was her grandfather, Don Isidro y Don Lino. They had little stores in the corner of our block. There was one telephone in the neighborhood, and that belonged to the guy at the corner. And he was nice enough to take messages or to send a kid to come call us to go answer the phone. And about that little school, and I said that they didn't want the Hispanics to cross Hemphill and go to Wilson Elementary. So they built this school, and my brother said, you know, I was in one of those first classes, and he said they thought it was too dangerous for the Hispanics to cross Hemphill. That was an excuse. He said, but then when they sent us all, when the school was finished, we were like cattle walking down the street, a whole bunch of Hispanics. And we went to that school. And the history, when they had been allowed to be at South Fort Worth, which is now Wilson, the Mexicanos were not allowed in the classrooms mixed with the Anglos. First they were outside. In cold weather, they were brought in to the basement. And this is what Albertina was telling me. She said, but first there was some lady that went into the ad building and told them. And so then they said, you should not have those Hispanics down in the basement. They need to be in classrooms. And she said, I think your mother was the one that went. My mother spoke broken English, but she went and talked to the superintendent, who was Mr. Green at that time, and he sent word that they better put the kids in classes. So they put them in the different classes. But when it was time to take a group picture, like they're doing now, the class picture, they got all the Hispanics together and took a picture of them. They were not allowed to take a picture with their classes. And I've got a picture of the one large class, and it looks like they're all different grades. They just bunched them together. Let me see, what else did I thought that was very important. Am I running out of time?
I think we still have a little bit more time.
Okay.
Well, we can also talk about what groups you belong to, what organizations you belong to.
Okay, I don't know if I can remember all of them, but, because in my time I've belonged to a lot. I belonged to Hispanic Women's League. Yeah, I remember. The Pan American Golf Association, Ladies Auxiliary. I belonged to that first group. The men didn't want, the golfers didn't want the women to organize, but my husband was president at that time. And isn't that silly? But we organized, and shortly after that, I was asked, would I be chairman of, we wanted debutantes. Hispanic debutantes had never taken place in Fort Worth. And so I took the chair and I started doing some research. One of our members said, nah, we shouldn't be trying to be what we're not. We're plain old folks. I thought, well, if I'm gonna have that against me, forget it. But the next year, Sarah Vallejo was the president, and she said, Tencha, why don't you take it? I'll give you my support. So I took it. And I went to Miss Lipscomb, a lady that was very instrumental in helping the assembly and the steeplechase Anglo debutante. And I called her, because one of my high school friends, Barbara Lau, she married Doug Tatum. I saw her at the mall one time, and I said, you know, I saw in the paper that your daughter-in-law, or future daughter-in-law, can you get me some information? She said, I sure will. So she called me, she said, you know what, Miss Lipscomb is ready for you. She said she's willing to come out and teach your girls the bow, because we didn't know anything about the bow. And Miss Lipscomb, she came out and taught us. She didn't charge anything. And she came out 2 or 3 times. That was the beginning of our first debutante ball that we had for Hispanics in Fort Worth. That was at Colonial Country Club. But I could tell right then that we outgrew that right away. We sold tickets. So the next year we had it at Ridgely Country Club, I believe. We even had it at the Worthington one year. But Mr. McMillan of the Coors Brewery, he sponsored us. He was glad to sponsor us. He knew that we would pay, you know, whatever, because you had to have a breakfast there. And so we had to sell tickets. And Mr. McMillan was very, very kind with us. We paid our bill on time. But that was the first Hispanic debutante ball here in Fort Worth. It was under the Pan American Golf Association. Then later, a few years later, somebody else wanted to have a debutante ball, and I didn't want to be chairman forever, so let them take it. And I think they're still doing, but it's very different from what we had back then.
And when you were growing up and during your adult life, what relations do you remember between African Americans and Mexican Americans or Hispanics in general?
Growing up as a little kid, I don't remember much. I don't remember that we had any contact because we didn't go to school with them. Mm-hmm. We didn't, you know, if you saw them, and there was a lot of discrimination at that time, not just against us. Theirs was terrible. So I didn't have any contact with them. I went to, you know, Katy Lake, South Fort Worth, Rosemont, Pasco, TCJC, and TCU. When I graduated from Pasco, there was one other Mexicano in my class. When I graduated from TCU, there were a lot of Hispanics.
Because it was several years.
Yeah,
afterwards.
But when I was little, I didn't have any contact with the African Americans.
And, that's one of the last questions, but would you like to add anything else to your interview?
I had so much here, but I'm going to give it to you because I have been wanting to share this. Here a few years ago, very few years ago, somebody wrote a book on the Latinos in Fort Worth. La Fundación was not included, and that was one of the oldest neighborhoods here. In fact, when my mother came, she would write back to her hometown and tell so-and-so, you ought to come, there's jobs here. And they would come. But a lot of them settled in the north side because some of their, like Hope and Mike Ayala, Hope's mother was comadre to my mother. And so they knew each other from Mexico. So that history that was written, I was very displeased with it. So when they told me to do this presentation at on the south side, I did a little bit of research, a lot that I can remember. My brother also remembers a lot. But I wanted to share it. I wanted to share it with someone, because how are we going to let Fort Worth have a history of Latinos, but what about this whole half town over here? So this is why I brought this along with me. The owner of the steel mill, Mr. Armstrong, way back in time, he had a rancho, and there was a little house that he was going to have torn down, and my daddy told him, why don't you let me have it? I have 11 kids, and I'd love to have that. So he put it on a flatbed truck and had it brought to my dad's lot, and that was the beginning of our house, Mr. George Armstrong. And many years later, one of my daughters was going to OLV, Our Lady of Victory School on Hemphill, and she would bring a little girl with her, Christy Armstrong. She was a great-great-granddaughter of Mr. Armstrong. And you know what? I would be making tortillas, and I'd be making tortillas on my stove, and I'd have a plate there where I was putting the cooked tortillas. And my kids love tortillas with butter on them, hot tortillas. And I could see that little hand, the little kid, come over, and her little fingers would take a tortilla, and she loved tortillas and butter. Mr. Armstrong's descendants. Can you imagine?
That's a great story. Well, thank you for letting us interview you. And there's archivists from the Fort Worth Public Library that would be more than happy to copy everything and put it in the public archive, which I think it's really important.
Okay.
And I've read that book from Fort Worth, and I agree with you that it's missing a lot on the south side. But I think there's a historian that's working on a new book, and hopefully he does a little better of the job. I haven't met him, so I don't know what he's writing about.
Well, that's how come I copied mine. When I made that presentation, I just had a lot of notes, but then I went and typed them out, and I've made copies. I want to give somebody here one. I don't want to.
There's archivists out there.